The CD Howe Institute's latest report card on the financial transparency of Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial governments has been released. The report ranks the senior governments on fiscal accountability. It revealed stark contrast between governments across the country. Alberta and Yukon topped the class in 2024 with scores of A- due to their timely releases, consistent accounting, and clear presentations. And Prince Edward Island scored the lowest with a D-. We were joined earlier by William B.P. Robson, the president and CEO of CD Howe Institute, to unpack the report.
We look at the financial statements and budgets that governments produce, trying to do it through the eyes of somebody who's motivated and can read numbers, but isn't an accounting expert. And the question is, how easy is it for a motivated but non-expert person to make sense of the presentations and the fiscal plans and how closely the results resembled the plan? And the good news is that some provinces and territories, Alberta and Yukon this time, do quite well. You don't have to be an expert to understand what they're up to. Unfortunately, though, there's a range of results. The federal government, which used to be excellent, has been pretty bad lately and was a C range grade this time. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And what we say in the report is, people shouldn't be embarrassed if they look at a government's budget presentation, if they look at a financial statement and it doesn't look right. People should feel confident to put their hand up and say, this doesn't look right, because it isn't necessarily the problem with you, the reader. It might be that the government isn't doing it right. Well, what's always surprising a little bit is when you see somebody drop. So I'll say, for example, in Ontario, where the financial statements and the budgets are very well presented. And so Ontario, in many ways, is operating at A level, but they're late with their stuff. And so that's disappointing. I mean, there's no excuse for delivering a budget after the fiscal year has begun. The fiscal year for the senior governments, the feds, the provinces, and the territories is April 1st. So you ought to be delivering your budget before that, ideally in February, not in April, not in May, after the fiscal year has already started. So that's a little disappointing. I'll mention the federal government as well with its C- rating. Now, a few years ago during COVID, they never even presented a budget, which was an unprecedented fail. So they got an F. But the thing that the feds do that's so irritating in their budgets is the key numbers are literally hundreds of pages deep in the document. So if you're not an expert who knows how to look for them, you could easily get like 50 pages in and maybe either give up or maybe see the wrong numbers and think they were the right numbers, because you'd be thinking, how could the right numbers be later than this? So there are a few things that governments do that are really quite frustrating. One controversial thing that governments do is they put contingency reserves of various kinds in their budgets. It's controversial because it can look like a slush fund. On the other hand, budgeting is uncertain. Things happen, floods happen, fires happen, other things happen. And so it's what we think is that it's good to have some kind of contingency in there. It should be transparent. It should be a number that's right there in the financial statements, in the budget, rather than something that's kind of hidden. Say you shade your revenue forecast down, that's objectionable because you're kind of misleading people. So one of the things that people have commented on, and some of the governments have commented on, is what's with this contingency reserve? Because what we do is we say, if you have one, you get a mark, but if it's too big, you don't. So that's one area where there's a bit of controversy, but we think we're steering a reasonable course because it's all about transparency. You want the government to make it evident what they're doing, but it can't be too big, because if it's too big, then the bottom line forecast stops being meaningful. The thing that we would most like to see is a situation such as you do see with Alberta, Yukon, and some other governments, where when you look at a budget or their end of year report, starting at page 1, flipping pages, you should be in no doubt whatsoever when you get to the page that shows you all the revenues, all the expenses, what the bottom line is, and ideally on the same page, as many governments do, what that means to their accumulated debt and their capacity to deliver services. It ought to be as straightforward as that. And for the governments that do, we give them a high grade, and We urge them to do more. For the governments that don't do so well, we give them a lower grade. And one of the things that we point out in the report is it's not that hard to do well. Deliver your budget on time, put the key numbers up front where people can read them, and right away there, you're well on your way to a B. There are a few more things you need to do to get an A, but it's not hard for governments to do this right. And when they're not doing it, you really have to question, why wouldn't they make it easy for people to understand the numbers?